The sun was slipping behind the hills when everything changed. What should have been an ordinary, quiet evening on the open plains turned into the moment a rancher stumbled onto a sight he would never forget. He had ridden this route 100 times before, checking fences, counting cattle, listening only to the wind brushing through dry grass. But this time something felt different. The air seemed heavy still, too quiet for comfort. His horse slowed on its own, ears twitching as if it sensed something the man could not yet see. Then he noticed her, a tiny figure standing alone in the fading light. A girl, thin, dusty, unmoving. She looked like she had been carved from the earth itself, planted in that very spot. At first he thought she was lost, maybe a traveler's child, maybe someone from town. But as he got closer, his breath caught in his chest. She wasn't just standing there. She was guarding something, protecting it with a stillness that didn't belong on a child's face. On the ground beside her was the body of a woman. He stopped his horse and didn't move for a long moment. The scene didn't make sense. A child alone with a body miles away from anyone, miles away from help. The rancher could feel his heartbeat rising. He wasn't afraid often, but something about this girl, something about her silence, made him feel like he had stepped into someone else's tragedy without warning. The girl didn't turn her head. She didn't run. She didn't cry. She just stood there, her eyes fixed forward as if she had been waiting for someone, anyone, to finally notice her. The rancher slid slowly off his horse, not wanting to scare her. He cleared his throat softly, hoping for a small reaction, a blink, a breath. But she stayed still as if moving would break something inside her. He felt a weight settle on him, a heavy, unfamiliar feeling, responsibility, fear, maybe even guilt. Why was she out here alone? Where had she come from? How long had she been standing like this? The wind brushed across the plains again, lifting a few strands of her hair. She still didn't look up. The rancher took a hesitant step toward her, knowing deep down that whatever happened next wasn't something he could simply ride away from. The rancher stood still for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the dimming light as the last streaks of orange faded from the sky. The land around him stretched wide and quiet, the way it always did at the end of the day. The prairie was usually full of soft sounds, crickets waking up, birds settling in, cattle murmuring in the distance. But here, in this small circle of space where the girl stood, everything felt muted, as if the world was holding its breath. His boots pressed into the dry dirt as he took another step forward. The girl didn't flinch. She didn't shift her feet or turn her head. She was rooted in place, one hand curled at her side, the other resting lightly on the still shoulder of the woman on the ground. It was a gesture that said everything. A silent message: don't take her, don't touch her, she's still mine. That single detail made the rancher's throat tighten. This wasn't just a lost child. This was a child who had been holding on long after any child should have had too. He eased closer, scanning the area with the instinct of a man who had lived long enough to know danger often hid in unexpected corners. There were no footprints except the girl's, no wagon tracks, no scattered belongings, just dust, silence, and grief. The woman on the ground was pale, her clothes torn, her shoes worn thin. He couldn't tell if she had collapsed from illness, exhaustion, or something darker. Whatever happened, it hadn't happened more than a day or two earlier. The rancher felt a familiar heaviness building in his chest, the feeling that came before he had to take responsibility for something he didn't ask for. He hated that feeling. It always meant trouble. It always meant change. He looked back at the girl. She was small, maybe 7 or 8. Her dress hung loose on her frame, the fabric stiff with dust. Her hair was tangled, falling in rough strands over her face. But it was her eyes that held him. Wide, dark, unblinking. They were the eyes of someone who had seen too much too soon, someone who didn't quite trust the world anymore. He crouched a few feet from her, lowering himself slowly so he wouldn't seem threatening. His knees cracked as he bent down, the sound echoing louder than he expected. Still, the girl didn't move. The rancher cleared his throat again, this time more gently. "Hey," he said softly. "You all right, kid?" The wind swallowed his words, carrying them away before they reached her. Or maybe she heard them and chose not to answer. He tried again, his voice careful and steady. "I'm not gonna hurt you." Her expression stayed exactly the same, but he saw something in her eyes, a flicker, small as a candle flame. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it wasn't fear either. It was something in between, something fragile. He followed her gaze down to her mother. The rancher knew death. He'd seen it in animals, in neighbors, even in his own family. But death around a child always sat differently, like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples across everything nearby. He let out a long breath, rubbing the back of his neck as he tried to piece together the story. Where had they come from? How far had they walked? Why had no one come looking? His eyes traveled across the horizon. Nothing but open land, no smoke from a campfire, no movement, no sound of hooves or wheels. They were completely alone. The rancher shifted a little closer, resting one hand on the ground to steady himself. He looked up at the girl again. "How long have you been here?" he asked softly. Her lips parted for the smallest moment, but no words came out. Just a tiny breath, brittle and thin. She blinked once, slow. It was the first movement she had made since he arrived. He didn't push her. He knew forcing questions on a scared child would get him nowhere. Instead, he looked around, scanning for clues. The ground near the woman was disturbed, as if she had stumbled or fallen suddenly. There were faint marks in the dirt where the girl had knelt at some point, maybe trying to wake her mother. A strip of cloth lay nearby, torn from the woman's sleeve, stained with something dark. It looked like the girl had tried to stop a wound. She must have stayed with her mother through the day, through the night, refusing to leave even when the cold crept in and fear set deep inside her. The rancher felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Kids shouldn't have to endure something like this. They should cry, run, seek help. But this girl, she'd stayed. She'd watched over her mother alone, waiting for someone who might never come. He wiped a bit of dust from his palm and tried to soften his voice even more. "You're out here by yourself, aren't you?" The girl's eyes shifted, just slightly. She looked at him for the first time, not fully, but enough for him to see the depth of the pain she was carrying. Then her gaze slid back to her mother, as if she was reminding herself that she couldn't leave. The rancher let out a slow exhale. He understood now. She wasn't frozen because she didn't want help. She was frozen because accepting help meant stepping away from her mother. It meant admitting she was gone. It meant letting go of the last piece of her life that still felt safe. A sudden gust of wind rippled across the ground, lifting dust into the air. The rancher watched the girl squeeze her mother's shoulder a little tighter, as if to shield her from the wind even now. He felt something shift inside him, something he hadn't felt in years, a quiet tug of compassion that he'd buried long ago. He wasn't sure he wanted to feel it again, but the sight of her trembling fingers told him he didn't have a choice. He took one more step closer, closing the distance between them. The fading light wrapped around them both, stretching shadows across the ground. The rancher knew he couldn't leave her here. He couldn't turn away from a child who had already lost everything. But he also knew that helping her would change the rest of his life. He rested his hand near hers, not touching, not forcing, just close enough to show he wasn't going anywhere. The girl didn't pull away, and in that small, silent moment, something between them shifted. The wind held its breath again. The plains quieted. The rancher realized this wasn't just a discovery. It was the beginning of a responsibility he never expected to carry. The rancher let his eyes linger on the girl a moment longer before shifting them to the still body beside her. Up close, the story written on the woman's skin, on her clothing, even on the tired lines of her face, began to unfold. Nothing about her looked careless. Nothing looked reckless. She wasn't someone who had wandered out here without reason. She had the look of a mother who had been fighting for a long time, fighting against life, against fear, against everything that threatened her child. And in the end, she had lost that fight somewhere along this lonely stretch of land. Her clothes were simple, worn thin from travel. The edges of her sleeves were frayed, the hem of her dress patched by hand. A small pack sat a few feet away, half open, showing only a blanket and a tin cup inside. Not much to carry, not much to start a new life with. But the rancher could tell she had tried. He could see the effort in the way she had stitched her own clothing, in the clean corner of the blanket she had folded over her daughter, in the beads sewn carefully along the little girl's collar, now dulled with dust. The rancher felt the air tighten around his chest as he studied her face. Even in death, there was a trace of worry on her features, a crease between her brows, lips slightly parted, as if she had tried to speak one last time but didn't have enough breath to finish her sentence. He wondered what her final thoughts were. He wondered if they were about the child now standing guard over her. He glanced at the girl again. Her jaw trembled a little, only visible when the wind brushed against her cheek. She had been so still earlier that he hadn't noticed how exhausted she was. Her eyes were red at the edges, but she hadn't cried in front of him. Maybe she had cried herself out during the night. Maybe she had cried quietly, the kind of crying that doesn't make a sound because no one is there to hear it. He let out a slow breath through his nose. The mother must have known her time was short. She must have felt herself slipping away. The rancher had seen that look before, the look of someone trying to stay alive for someone else, trying to hold on long enough to make sure their child would be safe. But something had stopped her. Maybe hunger, maybe sickness, maybe a long journey that drained the last bit of strength she had. He moved his gaze to the horizon, imagining the path they might have taken. The land stretched for miles, dry and unforgiving. If they had been walking for days, every step must have felt heavier than the last. The mother might have staggered. She might have pushed the girl ahead, telling her to keep going. She might have told her she would be right behind her, even as her knees buckled. And the girl, small, loyal, determined, must have run back the moment her mother fell. He saw the faint drag marks near the body, the kind left by small hands trying desperately to lift someone far too heavy. His throat tightened as he realized she had tried to pull her mother to safety. Maybe under shade, maybe toward a patch of grass, anywhere that felt less final than the place where she had collapsed. But the girl wasn't strong enough. And when she realized she couldn't move her mother, she had simply stayed. Stayed as the sun rose, stayed as it fell again, stayed when fear crept in, stayed even when hunger gnawed at her belly. The rancher studied the woman's hands. They were rough, covered in small cuts and dried blood. Not the kind from violence. These were work wounds. Scars from cooking fires, from sewing needles, from carrying things too heavy for one person. Hands that had held her daughter countless times. Hands that had protected, fed, and comforted. Now they lay still in the dirt, fingers curled slightly as if reaching for the child one last time. A gust of wind rolled across the ground, lifting dust around them. The rancher lowered his head and reached out slowly to brush a strand of hair from the woman's face. It felt wrong to leave her lying like this, without dignity. But even as he touched her, he felt the weight of the girl's stare on him. She watched his every movement with the intensity of someone guarding the only thing that mattered. He looked up at her again, her lips pressed together. Her chin quivered, but she held her ground. She stepped slightly forward, not enough to threaten him, not enough to push him away, but enough to say, "She's mine. She's still my mother." The rancher swallowed hard. He wasn't used to moments like this. Most of his days were spent with cattle, fences, and long silences that didn't require explanations. But this silence was different. This one was full of stories dying to be told, full of emotions too heavy for a child to carry. He looked back at the mother and wondered what her last day had been like. Had she whispered goodbye? Had she told her daughter to stay strong? Had she made the girl promise not to leave her side? Or had she simply slipped away, leaving the girl to figure out the world on her own? A flash of something caught his eye. Around the mother's neck rested a small necklace. Not fancy, just a thin cord with a worn wooden bead. But it looked important. It looked like something she might have passed to her daughter if she'd had the chance. The rancher hesitated a moment, then gently lifted the necklace. The bead was warm from the fading sun. He glanced at the girl again. Her eyes followed his hand, not with anger but with longing, as if she recognized it, as if she wanted it desperately but didn't dare ask. The rancher softened his expression. He held the necklace out toward her, keeping his hand steady. The girl stared at it, then at him. Her eyes filled with something raw, something cracked open by the sight of something familiar. She didn't reach for it yet, but her feet shifted just an inch in his direction. The rancher felt something settle deep inside him. The mother's story wasn't finished. It lived in her daughter now, and whether he wanted it or not, he had become part of that story the moment he rode into this clearing. The girl's small shoulders rose and fell with shallow breaths. She still hadn't spoken a word, but her silence carried more weight than anything she could have said. As the rancher watched her, he could see the exhaustion hiding beneath her stillness. Her eyelids drooped every few seconds, only for her to force them open again, as if afraid that closing her eyes meant abandoning her mother. She had been fighting sleep the way her mother had fought sickness, desperately, stubbornly, and all alone. Her feet were planted in the dirt, bare and bruised from walking. He saw tiny cuts along her toes, and the cracked skin around her ankles told him she had traveled a long distance. Her dress clung to her legs in stiff folds, as if it had dried after being wet with either rain or tears. The fabric was wrinkled and dotted with dirt stains. From the way she stood, always slightly forward, ready to shield the body at her feet, he could tell she had been standing in that exact spot for hours, if not longer. The rancher lowered himself to sit on one knee, not wanting to tower over her. He tried to imagine what the past few days had been like for the child. When the mother collapsed, the girl must have panicked. She must have tugged at her mother's arms, shaken her shoulders, whispered her name over and over. When the woman didn't wake up, the girl probably cried until her throat burned. Then when the night came, fear must have sunk its claws in, fear of coyotes, fear of the dark, fear of being swallowed by the silence around her. And yet she did not run. She had stayed beside her mother, guarding her even when she was too tired to stand straight. Her stomach let out a tiny growl. It was so quiet the rancher almost missed it. The girl clenched her hands into fists, as if that tiny sound betrayed a weakness she wasn't willing to admit. She kept her eyes locked on her mother, refusing to give in to hunger or fear. But her legs trembled. Her breath hitched. Her fingers shook faintly, betraying the hours of standing still, refusing to leave her mother alone in the open. He wanted to reach out to her, to place a reassuring hand on her shoulder, but he paused. She was like a wild foal, frightened, wounded, and likely to bolt if he made the wrong move. So he stayed where he was, offering only his presence. The plains around them stretched endlessly, but in that small circle of earth, the world felt very small. Just a girl, a mother, and a man who had walked into a moment he didn't yet understand how to handle. The girl's eyes drifted for a moment, just long enough for him to see the exhaustion clinging to her. It wasn't just physical. It was the kind of exhaustion that comes from too much grief, too much fear, too much responsibility placed on a child who should never have had to carry it. He remembered how she had seemed carved from stone when he first saw her, but now he could see the cracks forming. The stiff, brave facade was slipping. Her mouth trembled again, and this time she pressed her lips together tightly to keep them steady. He wondered if she had eaten anything since the previous day. He wondered if she had slept at all. Her tiny frame seemed too fragile to keep standing, yet she did. She stayed because something inside her, a promise maybe, made her believe leaving would be a betrayal. The rancher took a slow breath. He knew hardship. He had lived through storms that tore roofs off barns and harsh winters that froze cattle in their tracks. But he had never seen a kind of strength like this, raw, desperate, and born from pure love. Children didn't guard the dead unless they felt they were all they had left. He shifted his weight and looked at her more carefully. A small pouch hung around her neck. The leather was cracked but well made, and its drawstrings were tied tight. That pouch might have carried something precious. Maybe a keepsake, maybe food she had saved, maybe something her mother told her never to lose. He didn't ask about it. He didn't need to. The way the girl rested her fingers on it every so often told him it was more important than anything he could offer in that moment. The sun dipped lower. painting the land in soft shades of blue and purple. The girl's shadow stretched behind her, long and thin. She swayed slightly, catching herself before she fell. The rancher stood halfway, ready to help, but she quickly straightened again, forcing strength she didn't have. She didn't want help. Not yet. She didn't trust him, not fully. To her, he was still a stranger. And strangers could take things away, her mother, her pouch, her memories, her last bit of safety. A soft wind stirred her hair. A strand fell over her face and she didn't even brush it away. She didn't blink when dust stung her eyes. She didn't shift when her legs quivered. She just kept watch. The rancher's jaw tightened. He could see a kind of determination only grief could create. The girl was waiting for something. Waiting for her mother to wake up. Waiting for someone she knew to come looking. Waiting for a world that no longer existed. Her stillness wasn't just sadness. It was hope refusing to die, even when everything else had already collapsed. A tiny sound escaped her, something between a gasp and a whimper. It was the first sound she had made since he arrived. It slipped out before she could stop it. She quickly wiped her nose with the back of her hand and looked away, as if ashamed of the noise. The rancher swallowed hard. He didn't want to scare her, but he also couldn't stand by and watch her suffer alone. He took a slow breath and reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a small piece of dried bread, something he carried when he rode out for long hours. He held it out to her, keeping his arm steady and his voice gentle. "You hungry, kid?" Her eyes flicked toward his hand. For a heartbeat, her strength cracked. Hunger, instinct, and exhaustion fought with loyalty and fear. Her lips parted slightly, but she stayed where she was. She didn't move toward the food. She didn't shake her head either. She just stared, torn between survival and staying faithful to the promise she had made silently at her mother's side. The rancher didn't push. He placed the bread on the ground where she could reach it later. Then he leaned back slightly, giving her space again. The girl's eyes drifted away from the food almost immediately, back to the still body she refused to leave. And in that moment, the rancher realized something painfully clear. She wasn't just guarding her mother. She was clinging to the only piece of her world that hadn't abandoned her yet. The rancher stayed crouched in the dirt, still holding the quiet space between himself and the girl, trying to figure out how to reach her without shattering whatever thin thread of strength she was clinging to. The wind shifted again, carrying the faint smell of dust and the cold hint of night. Soon, darkness would settle fully across the plains, and he knew they couldn't stay here. Coyotes would come out. The chill would bite at their bones. The girl was already shaking from exhaustion, but if he tried to force her to leave, she might run, or collapse, or break in a way he didn't want to imagine. He let his gaze settle on her face, on the determination carved across her small features. It was the kind of determination that didn't come from bravery alone. It came from loss, from love, from a promise she felt responsible to keep with every breath she took. She was guarding her mother's memory with a fierceness most adults couldn't muster. But he also saw a different truth hidden beneath her unblinking stare. She was terrified. Terrified of leaving her mother. Terrified of being alone. Terrified of trusting someone she didn't know. The rancher shifted his weight and spoke again, this time quieter. "You can't stay out here all night, kid. It's not safe." She didn't react. Not in her face, not in her posture. But he saw her fingers tighten just slightly around the pouch hanging from her neck. That tiny movement told him she had heard him. It also told him she wasn't ready to move. He exhaled slowly. He wasn't a man who carried soft words in his pockets. He wasn't used to comforting anyone. He'd spent most of his life talking to cattle and wind, and sometimes to the empty rooms of his ranch house. But right now, he needed to find the right words. Words that didn't push. Words that didn't pull. Words that simply reached her where she was. He took off his hat and placed it beside him. "I ain't here to take anything from you," he said. "Not your things, not your memories, not your mother." He paused, letting the words sink into the still air. "But I can't walk away and leave you here. I won't." A flicker passed through the girl's eyes. It was quick, so quick anyone else would have missed it, but he saw it. A tiny fracture in her frozen stance. Fear mixed with something else. Confusion. maybe even a small, hidden hope she didn't dare let herself feel. He leaned slightly closer. "I can help bury her proper," he said softly. "Give her the respect she deserves." He glanced at the mother again. "She looks like she worked real hard to protect you. And I'm guessing she'd want you safe now." The girl's breath hitched. Her chin dipped by a fraction, then lifted again. In that tiny motion, he saw the war happening inside her. She didn't want to leave her mother behind. She didn't want to accept anything that meant letting go. But she also knew she couldn't stand there forever. The rancher rubbed his thumb along the edge of his glove. He remembered moments from his own past, losses he didn't speak of, nights he spent alone with only silence to keep him company. He remembered standing beside someone he loved and wishing for a miracle that never came. He remembered how it felt to walk away from that moment, knowing nothing would ever be the same. He swallowed hard. "Listen," he said, voice steady but gentler than before, "you don't gotta trust me yet. You don't gotta say anything either, but you can't keep fighting by yourself. Not out here." Another breath. Another small shift of her weight. Her legs trembled and he worried she might fall. So he slowly moved to sit cross-legged in the dirt, making himself smaller, less threatening. The evening breeze lifted the edge of his shirt. He didn't move. Minutes passed. Neither of them spoke. The sky deepened into a darker blue and the first stars pricked through the fading light. The girl's eyes glistened, not from tears but from sheer exhaustion. She swayed again. This time the rancher leaned forward, reaching out a steadying hand, but he stopped an inch before touching her. He didn't want to push her too soon. She blinked slowly, her gaze drifting from her mother's face to his hand. She looked at it as if trying to decide whether it was safe. The rancher lowered his hand a little. He spoke barely above a whisper. "You're common with me, kid." The words left his mouth before he could stop them. They felt heavy, final, like a promise he hadn't planned to make but now couldn't take back. The phrase hung in the air between them, wrapped in quiet certainty. It wasn't a command. It wasn't a threat. It was a decision. One he had made the moment he'd seen her standing alone in that clearing. The girl's breath caught. She stared at him, truly looked at him for the first time. Her lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to speak but couldn't find the voice to push even a single word out. Fear flickered in her eyes, but so did relief. She was too tired to fight anymore, too hungry to pretend she wasn't, too lonely to keep pretending she didn't need someone. The rancher placed his hat back on his head. He reached for the bread again, sliding it a little closer. "You'll eat when you're ready," he murmured. "We'll take your mama with us for now. We'll do right by her. I promise." The girl didn't move, but something inside her shifted, something subtle but unmistakable. She let her shoulders fall just a little. She loosened her jaw. Her fingers slipped away from their tight grip around her pouch. She was still guarding her mother, but the rigid wall she had built around herself was no longer unbreakable. The rancher rose slowly to his feet. He didn't want to rush her. He didn't want to scare her. He simply wanted her to know he wasn't leaving. Not now. Not ever, if that was what it took to keep her safe. And for the first time since he'd arrived, the girl's eyes softened. Not with trust, not yet, but with something fragile and hopeful that had been buried deep beneath fear. She wasn't ready to go, but she was no longer refusing to be saved. The rancher stood slowly, brushing dust from his knees, careful not to make any sudden movement that might push the girl back into fear. The sky above them deepened into a quiet, velvety darkness, with a sliver of moon rising behind the hills. Night was coming fast. He could feel the temperature dropping, the kind of chill that seeped into your bones if you stayed still too long. The girl wouldn't last out here, not another hour, but he knew he had to let her move at her own pace, even if that pace was painfully slow. He reached for his horse's reins and brought the animal a little closer. The horse snorted softly, lowering its head as if it sensed the fragile tension in the air. The rancher gave the mare a gentle pat, then turned back toward the girl. She watched him intently, her body held in a tight brace, ready to shield her mother from anything she didn't understand. He stepped closer to her mother's still form. "I'm gonna lift her," he said quietly, "so she can rest better, and so you ain't gotta stand out here in the cold." The girl stiffened. Her hands curled into fists, and for a moment he worried she might collapse from the strain of trying to hold herself together. He paused again, not touching the body yet, letting her see he wasn't in a hurry. He let the wind fill the silence for a few seconds. The girl's trembling slowed. She didn't nod. She didn't step back, but she didn't stop him either. Carefully, respectfully, he bent down and slid his arms beneath the woman's shoulders and knees. Her body was lighter than he expected, far too light. The kind of light that spoke of long hunger and endless travel. The girl's breath hitched sharply as he lifted her mother off the ground. She reached out instinctively, her fingers brushing the hem of her mother's skirt, needing that last point of contact. He adjusted his grip, holding the weight gently, almost protectively. The girl stepped forward close enough that her shoulder touched his leg. It wasn't trust. It was need. She had lived in silence with fear as her only companion, and now that things were shifting, she clung to the one thing she could, her mother's presence, even in another's arms. The rancher carried the body toward the horse. The girl followed, each step small and shaky. When he tied the woman's body securely across the saddle, the mare stood still, unmoving, as if she understood the gravity of what she carried. He turned to the girl again. "You ready?" he asked softly. Her eyes flicked toward the horizon, toward the place where she had stood guard for so long. The dust glinted faintly in the moonlight, like the ground was whispering goodbye. She didn't take the bread. She didn't reach for his hand, but she stepped toward him, just one step, and that was enough. The rancher lifted her gently, cradling her under her arms and set her onto the horse. She wobbled, not used to the height, but he steadied her with a large hand on her back. She didn't flinch at his touch this time. Her hands gripped the saddle horn, knuckles white, but the fear in her eyes had changed. It no longer screamed of danger. It trembled with uncertainty, like she was leaving a world she understood, even if that world was broken. He climbed up behind her, settling into the saddle. She stiffened at the closeness, but her small body leaned instinctively against him for balance. His steady frame offered warmth she hadn't felt in days. The mare shifted her weight, and the girl let out a tiny gasp, clutching the saddle tighter. "It's all right," the rancher murmured, his voice low and even. "I've got you." She said nothing, but her shoulders eased just a fraction. He clicked his tongue and the horse began moving, slow at first as if giving the girl time to adjust. The clearing drifted farther behind them with each step. The girl craned her neck to look back. She kept her eyes locked on the patch of earth where her mother had lain, watching until it faded into the darkness. The rancher didn't rush her. He let the horse walk at a soft, rocking pace. The girl's head drooped once, jerking back up as she forced herself awake. She wanted to stay alert, to stay aware, to stay strong, but her body betrayed her. Exhaustion tugged at her like an invisible hand pulling her downward. A few minutes later, she swayed again. This time the rancher rested a steady hand on her shoulder. She didn't pull away. The warmth of his palm seemed to anchor her, to remind her she was finally not alone. Her breathing changed, slower, heavier. The stiffness in her back softened. She leaned against him, her head barely touching his chest. It wasn't trust, not yet. It was exhaustion overpowering her fear. But the rancher knew the difference, and he didn't move a muscle. He let her rest exactly where she was. The horse's hooves thudded rhythmically against the dirt, a steady heartbeat guiding them through the night. The moon cast long shadows across the plains. The rancher kept his gaze ahead, watching for danger, feeling the small, fragile weight of the girl pressed against him. At some point, she stopped fighting sleep. Her body sagged fully into him, tiny breaths brushing his shirt. Her fingers loosened around the saddle horn and slipped against his arm. He adjusted his hold, making sure she wouldn't fall. She didn't stir. He glanced down at her peaceful, tired face. A lump rose in his throat, unexpected and unwelcome. He wasn't a father. He wasn't a man who took in strays. His life was simple, quiet, built on routines he didn't plan on changing. But as the girl slept against him, as her mother lay across the horse's back, and as the vast, empty land surrounded them, he realized something had shifted. His life wasn't quiet anymore. And the girl riding with him, this small, brave child who refused to abandon her mother, had just stepped into his world in a way he couldn't undo. The wind carried the sound of her faint breathing, and he held the reins tighter, guiding them home through the dark.